In this video, we're going to talk about Edward M. Erdelac's novel, Merkabah Rider. I say novel, it's kind of more a series of short novellas, but they have an overarching plot. It's I guess more like watching a series of episodes of a show, maybe like Supernatural or something like this. This is also my first weird Western that I've ever read, as far as I remember. So Merkabah Rider, it is set in the 1870s, I think, 1880s, yeah, 1870s. It's about a Jewish mystic known as the Rider, who basically wanders the deserts of the American Southwest, the American Midwest, etc., etc., searching for his former master who betrayed their mystical sect, killed everybody except the Rider, and is working with these dark forces for purposes as yet unknown. So this is the sort of premise of it, but in each of the stories in this collection, and presumably in the other collections as well, I've only read the first book so far. There's 4 books. In each of the stories, the Rider is confronted by a different kind of dark foe that must be engaged with and defeated. And he defeats these enemies through a combination of spiritual action, where he puts himself into a trance or sort of leaves his physical body to the ethereal plane, and through years of practice and rigorous spiritual discipline and stuff like this, he can go up to heaven, he can go down into hell, or he can engage with spirits on the earthly plane. So he can do that, and he fights spirits on that incorporeal plane. He also fights enemies on the physical plane, the corporeal plane. The fact that he is a Hasidic Jew draws quite a bit of comment in the Old West. Jews were not incredibly uncommon in the Old West, despite the fact that we tend to think we tend to have this rather inaccurate picture of the demographics of the Wild West from Hollywood movies and things like this, where the majority of people are white English speakers. More recent movies have done a better job showing the diversity of the West. There were a lot of Jews who went west in one capacity or another. Hasids were somewhat less likely to go west, to go to the frontier, sometimes to some of the big cities of the West, like San Francisco and places like this. But the fact that he is clearly an observant Jew draws a good amount of attention, often negative attention. This is, of course, the Wild West in the 1870s in anti-Semitic America. And so a lot of the conflict on the physical plane that he engages with is people who, in one way or another, are prejudiced or take issue with him for one reason or another. On the more spiritual plane, he encounters a pretty wide range of enemies. He encounters, in the first story in this collection, which is the Blood Libel, basically he wanders into this small town where the Christian townsfolk are about to destroy Little Jerusalem, the small local Jewish community. Basically, the reason that they're going to do this is because there's been an escalating series of livestock thefts leading into kidnappings, starting with thefts of pigs, which is especially ironic because Jews are not allowed to consume pork and not really supposed to deal with pigs. But starts with pigs, expands to cattle, and then the children of some Mexican residents go missing. I think two children go missing, and then the daughter of the local priest, pastor, whatever he is, 13-year-old daughter goes missing. The assumption among the townsfolk is that the Jews of Little Jerusalem have taken these children to drink their blood in demonic sacrifices. This, of course, is the completely baseless and absolutely bullshit anti-Semitic stereotype known as the blood libel. It was the source of a lot of violence against Jews, particularly during the medieval period, but it's never really gone away, even though it's complete and utter nonsense. So, the Merkabah Rider has to figure out what is actually going on here. And he puts himself into a trance, goes out, sends his spirit out into Little Jerusalem, and essentially what he figures out is that Moloch, the Canaanite god Moloch, or the Philistine god Moloch, has somehow re-entered the world, has somehow come into this world and has basically converted this group of Jews into Canaanites. That's the term that the writer uses most commonly for them. Essentially, Moloch has converted them into his worshippers. And probably, I think there's debate about this among archaeologists and historians, but one very common idea based on Greek and Roman sources particularly is that Canaanites, the Phoenicians, these different groups who worshipped Moloch, the way that they worshipped him was the sacrifice of children by putting these children into a giant metal statue of Moloch that was heated up with a fire. Basically, a fire was built under it, and they would roast children alive. Because the actual deity or demon or whatever it is, Moloch, has come to the world in this story, this cult is revived. And the Jews of Little Jerusalem in this town have built a metal statue, and they are sacrificing people to Moloch. The rider has to fight the leader of this cult and fight Moloch himself, and then help the girl, the pastor's daughter who's been kidnapped, to escape from this horrible fate. The rider is successfully able to do this. Very, very difficult task. He is significantly injured, but manages to do it. Meanwhile, in this first story, the rider's physical body, which has been just left unconscious as his spirit body goes and fights Moloch, the rider's physical body is taken by these two guys that he had earlier had a confrontation with, and they kind of beat him up, they spit on him, things like this. But when he remains unconscious, they decide they're just going to hang him. They spend a tremendous amount of time doing this, etc., etc., and eventually the rider's spirit comes back into his body after having won the ethereal battle, at which point he kills the two men who are trying to to hang him, the two men who are really driving that action, and then he runs everybody else off. So this is kind of the broad structure of the Merkabah Rider stories, is there is this combination of spiritual battle and physical battle that substantially wears down the rider both physically and spiritually, but in one way or another he manages to overcome his foes. A lot of it is rooted specifically in Jewish mysticism, the Jewish tradition. We get characters like Lilith, who shows up in the Nightjar Women. She's the primary villain, and her demonic children, who are succubi, who are these demonic temptresses, etc., etc. We also get some other traditions, and that's one of the things I think is really quite interesting here. I mean, probably the most overt is a sort of Lovecraftian tradition, because we get a number of references from these demonic entities to the old ones who are coming. In his first book, Merkabah Rider, High Plains Drifter, we don't really get that clear a sense of it. Like, it's clearly this is something that's going to be set up over the course of the series of books. But that Lovecraftian tradition, that Weird West tradition, is definitely here. But we also have, for instance, the story The Dust Devils, where Kelly, I forget what his first name is. Kelly is a hoodoo man, and a very virulent, dark magic type hoodoo. Hoodoo, for those of you who aren't familiar with this distinction, voodoo is the syncretic religion of Francophone areas like Haiti and New Orleans. Hoodoo is the syncretic tradition of much of the Anglophone South in the US. So it's a combination of Christian traditions with West African deities and different mystical traditions. Kelly is a former slave who he had a quite difficult relationship with his slave owners, complex relationship with his parents, but essentially he really mastered these dark forces in order to take revenge on the people who destroyed his family, and then he became obsessed with power and things like this. So we do have that difference of traditions here. This is not just Jewish mysticism. This is a broad range of mystical traditions that are brought in. But what's interesting about that, Kelly is not just a hoodoo mystic. He thinks that he's a servant of this Loa, or spirit, called Kalfu. But when the rider confronts Kalfu, when Kelly calls him forth, the rider confronts Kalfu, and it turns out that this is a fallen angel. We know that because the rider says, "You are one of Samyaza's fallen, the watchers who turned from their duty to God for the carnal pleasures of mortal women and let loose the bastard Nephilim on the earth in the days of Enoch." So the Nephilim in the Bible were the children of fallen angels and human women. So here we have a fallen angel from the Jewish tradition posing as Aloha in the Hoodoo tradition. And so that somewhat undermines the cosmopolitan aspects of this book. But we do also have other elements, and I like the cosmopolitan aspect of it. In the final story, the Shomer Express, the writer is confronted with an Arabic or Middle Eastern ghoul, or ghoul, as we would say in English. So we do have these different traditions that all come together, and there is this interesting sort of impression that all mystical traditions are in some way interconnected, and familiarity with all of them is what allows the writer to be successful. Now, the other thing that's interesting is there are some real-world references in this book. In The Nightjar Women, which I think is one of my favorite stories in the collection. In The Nightjar Women, we have a character named Johnny Behan, who owns a saloon and whorehouse. He is in a complicated relationship with this woman who calls herself Sadie. She's Jewish. The writer is infatuated with her, but it's also complicated because Lilith is there and her children who are succubi, and so there's a whole set of concerns about whether or not there's real love there, or whether this is just this sort of crazy town where they're trying... The succubi are basically trying to mate with as many men as possible. Sadie is not a succubi, by the way. So they can produce demon offspring, etc., etc. But I was actually struck by the name Johnny Behan when the first time I encountered that in the story, and I just kind of assumed it was a coincidence. Because if you know the story of the gunfight at the OK Corral and Wyatt Earp's time in Tombstone, Arizona, Johnny Behan was the town sheriff, whereas Wyatt Earp and his brothers were marshals. Toward the end of the story, Sadie tells the writer that she and Johnny are going to move to the town of Tombstone, and she tells him her real name, which is Josephine Marcus. Josephine Marcus was the name of the woman who had been Johnny Behan's girlfriend, the real Johnny Behan, in Tombstone, Arizona, who then left Behan to become the common law wife of Wyatt Earp. So that was another source of tension between the two men. So again, you get those nice little historical references for people who have a reasonably detailed knowledge of the American West. You get these great sort of Easter egg moments.